They say heaven speaks softly, but sometimes it chooses thunder so a wounded heart will finally listen. The storm arrived over Blackwater Ridge just after dusk, rolling across the town in long sheets of silver rain that blurred the streetlights and turned every road into shining glass. Wind pressed against storefront windows, rattled porch signs, and carried the smell of wet cedar through the empty streets. Most people had gone home early, doors locked, curtains drawn, waiting for the weather to pass. But Ethan Walker kept walking. At 40 years old, Ethan moved with the steady caution of a man who had learned long ago that storms outside were easier than storms within. His broad shoulders were wrapped in a faded canvas jacket darkened by rain. His jeans clung heavy at the knees, and water ran from the brim of his old cap in a slow, patient rhythm. The years had marked him quietly. Silver touched the edges of his brown hair. A few lines rested beside eyes once bright and now careful. He had served his country, buried too much, and returned home carrying the kind of silence no metal could lighten. Beside him padded Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick coat of ash gray and cream, ears tall as antenna towers, eyes amber and alert. Ranger walked half a step ahead, as if the world had assigned him the duty of going first. He had once trained beside soldiers, but now he served one wounded man who never asked for help. Ethan trusted the dog more than clocks, maps, or promises. Ranger never barked without reason. The pair had no destination that night. Some evenings Ethan walked because motion was easier than memory. Rain drummed on parked cars and spilled from gutters in bright streams. Neon from a diner sign trembled across puddles like broken stars. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled low and thoughtful. Ethan slipped his hands into his pockets and kept moving, while Ranger's paws made soft splashes at his side. Then the dog stopped. Not hesitated. Stopped. His body stiffened, ears sharpened forward, and a deep sound rose in his chest. Ethan knew that sound. It was not fear. It was warning. Ranger lunged toward the next intersection, leash pulling. Tight. Easy, boy, Ethan said, quickening his pace. But Ranger barked once, sharp enough to cut through rain. At the corner, beneath a flickering street lamp, stood an old man in a white coat. He faced the wrong direction, cane lowered at his side, unmoving in the middle of the crosswalk while water rushed around his shoes. His eyes were open but empty, staring into darkness that did not stare back. Headlights suddenly appeared through the rain, fast and too close, sliding down the hill toward the intersection. Tires hissed on wet pavement. Ethan's breath caught. The truck horn cried out, thin and late. Time narrowed to one heartbeat. Ranger barked again, louder now, while the old man remained still, as calm as a statue in a storm. Ethan ran. Boots splashed hard against the street. Rain struck his face like thrown gravel. He reached the stranger just as the headlights flooded them both in white. With all the strength years had left him, Ethan wrapped an arm around the old man and pulled him clear to the sidewalk. The truck swept past, missing them by inches, then straightened and vanished into the curtain of rain. For a moment, only thunder remained. Ethan knelt, catching his breath. The old man's gloved hand slowly rose and touched Ethan's cheek with surprising steadiness. His voice, when it came, was gentle as candlelight. "Your wife still prays for you." Ethan froze. Ranger lowered his head and stared into the rain as if someone else stood there unseen. Some truths do not strike like lightning. They settle slowly, like rain into old wood. Ethan remained kneeling on the sidewalk, one hand braced against the wet concrete, while the old man stood as if nothing unusual had happened. Water streamed from the brim of the stranger's white coat, yet the fabric looked strangely untouched, clean in a storm that had soaked everything else. Ranger circled once, then came to Ethan's side and pressed his shoulder gently against the veteran's arm. It was the dog's way of asking whether the world was still safe. Ethan rose carefully, eyes fixed on the man before him. "How did you know that?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. The old man tilted his head, listening. To the rain rather than the question. His face was lined but peaceful, the kind of face shaped by sorrow carried well. A grieving heart has its own sound, he said softly. Some can hear it. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. Few people in Blackwater Ridge knew about Claire anymore. It had been 3 winters since she passed, and Ethan had spent most of those years making sure no one saw what remained of him. He worked odd jobs, kept to himself, and spoke only when necessary. Pain, he had learned, often stayed quieter when left alone. Yet this stranger had reached into the locked room of his life with one sentence. Ranger stepped closer to the old man and sniffed the hem of the white coat. Then, unexpectedly, the dog lowered his head in calm respect. Ethan had seen Ranger distrust smiling men, avoid polished offices, and growl at hands that meant harm. But now the shepherd stood still, tail low, eyes soft, as if greeting someone familiar. You should not be out here, Ethan said at last. Where do you live? The old man raised a weathered hand and pointed toward the ridge above town, where scattered lights glowed through the rain. On the hill, he said. The house with the porch lamp. Ethan looked up. Through the curtain of weather he could barely make out a warm amber light high above the trees. I will drive you, he said. Roads are slick. Kindness again, the man replied with a faint smile. You make a habit of giving what hurts to give. Ethan did not answer. He simply led the way to his truck parked half a block down. The old pickup coughed to life after 2 tries, heater rattling awake like an old furnace remembering duty. Ranger jumped into the back seat, though he kept his eyes fixed on the stranger the entire time. The old man settled in the passenger seat with careful grace, cane resting across his knees. As Ethan drove uphill, windshield wipers beating their steady rhythm, the cab filled with the scent of rain, leather, and something else he could not place. Cedar, perhaps. Or old churches. What is your name? Ethan asked. Samuel, the man said. Samuel Reed. I am Ethan. I know. Ethan gripped the wheel tighter. Outside, the town lights faded below them while pines leaned in the wind like dark witnesses. When they reached the top of the ridge, a narrow gravel lane opened to a modest house with white siding, flower boxes beneath the windows, and a single porch lamp glowing gold against the storm. It looked lived in. Loved, even. Ethan pulled to a stop. Before he could step out, Samuel placed a hand on his wrist. His touch was warm and steady. Do not let sorrow convince you that heaven forgot your address, he said. Then he opened the door and walked alone through the rain toward the light. Ranger let out one quiet whine and would not look away. Morning does not always bring clarity. Sometimes it only reveals how strange the night truly was. Ethan remained parked at the end of the gravel lane long after Samuel disappeared inside the house. Rain softened to a whisper on the roof of the truck, and the porch lamp glowed warm through the dark like a promise too distant to trust. Ranger sat upright in the back seat, ears forward, watching the front door with unwavering focus. Come on, boy, Ethan murmured at last. He is home. Yet even as he said it, something unsettled him. There had been no other lights in the windows. No movement behind the curtains. No tire tracks in the mud besides his own. Still, the old man had walked with calm certainty, as though returning to a place expecting him. Ethan drove back down the ridge in silence. The town below looked washed clean by the storm. Streetlights reflected in puddles. Gutters still sang with runoff. He reached the small garage apartment he rented behind Miller's Hardware, dried Ranger with an old towel, and sat awake in the dark long after midnight. Samuel's words moved through the room like quiet footsteps. Your wife still prays for you. Ethan had not spoken Claire's name aloud in months. By sunrise the rain had passed, leaving the sky pale and clear. Sunlight touched the wet branches outside like polished glass. Ranger stood by the door before Ethan finished his coffee, tail stiff, waiting. You want to go back, Ethan said. The dog answered by pawing the floor once. 20 minutes later they were climbing the ridge again. Morning birds called from the pines. Mist lifted from the hollows in long white ribbons. Ethan expected to see the same neat house, the porch lamp now dark in daylight, maybe Samuel on the steps with some simple explanation that would make the night feel ordinary. But when they reached the lane, Ethan slowed hard. The gravel path was overgrown with weeds. Thorn vines crawled across a broken fence post. At the top of the rise stood no welcoming home, only the shell of one. The white siding had peeled gray with age. Several windows were boarded shut. The porch sagged inward. The lamp he had seen glowing only hours ago hung crooked and shattered beside the door. Ethan stepped from the truck without speaking. Ranger leaped down and moved ahead, nose low, scanning the ground. The front yard was knee-high with grass. No footprints marked the soft earth. No fresh tire tracks. No sign anyone had lived there in years. Ethan climbed the porch steps carefully. They groaned beneath his weight. Through a crack in the boards covering the front window, he saw only dust and shadows. A dead fern still sat by the wall inside, brittle as paper. "Samuel," he called once, feeling foolish the moment the name left him. Only wind answered through the trees. An older woman from the neighboring property appeared near a mailbox across the lane, carrying a basket of laundry. She studied Ethan with the frank curiosity of small towns. "You looking for somebody?" she asked. Ethan nodded toward the ruined house. "The man who lives there. Samuel Reed." The woman's expression changed slowly, like a curtain being drawn. "Son," she said, "nobody has lived there in near 30 years. Ethan felt cold despite the sun. "That cannot be right. I brought him home last night." She set the basket down and crossed herself without thinking. "Samuel Reed was blind as winter fog," she whispered. "And he died the summer of 1998. Ranger suddenly barked 3 sharp times, then ran to the far corner of the porch where the floorboards met the wall. He began scratching at one weathered plank as if something beneath it had been waiting all along. Some doors stay closed for years because they are waiting for the right hands to open them. Ethan stood frozen on the sagging porch while the neighbor woman backed away with her laundry basket held tight against her chest. She had already said more than she wanted to say. Ranger, however, had no interest in fear or gossip. The German shepherd scratched harder at the corner plank, nails clicking against old wood, then looked back at Ethan with the sharp impatience of a partner who expected action. Ethan stepped forward slowly, each board groaning beneath his boots. Dust lifted in thin curls from the porch floor. Up close, the plank Ranger had chosen looked no different from the others except for one thing. The nails along its edge were newer. Not fresh, but newer than the weathered rust surrounding them. Someone had lifted it once and sealed it again. Ethan crouched and ran his fingers along the seam. A small draft of cool air rose from beneath. He glanced toward the neighbor's house, but the woman had already gone inside. The ridge was quiet except for wind in the pines and the far cry of a hawk. "All right," he murmured. "Let us see what you found." He returned to the truck, grabbed a flat pry bar and hammer from the toolbox behind the seat, then knelt again beside Ranger. The dog sat close, eyes fixed on the plank, tail still. Ethan worked carefully, easing the metal beneath the board. Old nails complained with a dry groan, then gave way one by one. The plank lifted just enough to reveal darkness below. A narrow compartment had been built between the beams, no wider than a suitcase and hidden so neatly that decades might have passed without notice. Ethan set the board aside and reached into the hollow space. His fingers touched canvas first, stiff with age. He pulled out a weathered satchel tied with leather straps. Beneath it rested a cedar box no larger than a bread loaf. Even before opening it, he caught the faint scent of old wood and something sweet, like church incense lingering after years. Ranger lowered his nose to the satchel, sniffed once, then backed away respectfully. Ethan opened the bag first. Inside were neatly wrapped papers, yellowed but dry, a silver pocket watch stopped at 12:17, and a photograph in a cracked frame. He wiped the glass with his sleeve. The image showed a younger Samuel Reed standing beside a woman in a summer dress on this very porch, both smiling toward the camera. At their feet sat a German shepherd with alert ears and proud eyes. Ethan swallowed hard. Some loyalties, it seemed, outlived the body. He then opened the cedar box. Inside lay a single white envelope, untouched by moisture, sealed with dark blue wax impressed by the shape of a cross. Ethan's name was written across the front in careful script. Not Mr. Walker. Not resident. Simply Ethan. His throat tightened. He had never been here before last night. No one in town knew he had come to the ridge this morning. Yet there it was, waiting in a house abandoned for 30 years. The wind moved suddenly through the trees, carrying a low hush across the porch like distant voices speaking all at once. Ranger stood and turned toward the road, ears forward, then relaxed as if whoever approached had chosen not to be seen. Ethan stared at the envelope for a long moment before sliding one finger beneath the flap. Inside was a folded letter and a small brass key. The first line, written in the same steady hand, made the morning sun feel strangely far away. If you are reading this, kindness has guided you farther than grief ever could. Some letters are read with the eyes. Others are read by the wounds they find. Ethan remained kneeling on the porch, the envelope trembling slightly in his hand though the wind had gone still. Ranger sat beside him like a carved guardian, watching the trees, then the road, then Ethan again. The veteran unfolded the page carefully. The paper was thick and pale, untouched by age, and the handwriting moved across it with patient certainty. Ethan, if you are reading this, then you chose compassion when no reward was promised. That is how heaven often measures a man. Do not be troubled by the road that brought you here. Some meetings happen on clocks. Others happen on prayers. Ethan swallowed and continued. You have carried sorrow as if it were a duty. You have mistaken survival for living. Claire asked that you be reminded, love does not end where breath does. His vision blurred. He lowered the page and stared across the ridge where sunlight spilled over pine branches in bands of gold. He had spoken to no one about the final promise he made at Claire's bedside. Keep going, she had whispered. Even when I cannot walk beside you. He had failed that promise more times than he could count. Yet here, in a ruined house belonging to a man dead for decades, someone had written words no stranger should know. Ranger nudged Ethan's elbow gently. Ethan breathed once, then read on. Beneath this porch you found what was hidden. Beneath your grief there is also something hidden. Use the key. Go to St. Bartholomew Chapel at the edge of Miller Woods. Enter through the red side door before sunset. Bring the dog. Trust what waits in silence. No signature followed. Only a small mark pressed into the bottom of the page, the same cross from the wax seal. Ethan turned the brass key over in his palm. It was old, worn from his skin, cut in an unusual pattern with 3 narrow teeth. St. Bartholomew, he said quietly. He knew the place. The chapel had stood empty for years beyond the North Trail, half swallowed by ivy and time. Kids told ghost stories about it. Hunters used its parking lot to turn around. No services had been held there since before Ethan moved to town. He folded the letter with care and placed it back in the envelope. Inside the cedar box lay one final item he had not noticed before, a small silver ring threaded onto a chain. The inside engraving was nearly worn smooth, but he could still make out 2 words. Keep going. Ethan's chest tightened so sharply he had to steady himself on the porch rail. That phrase had belonged to Claire alone. She said it before job interviews, before surgeries, before hard winters, before every goodbye that felt too heavy to carry. He had buried her wearing those words in his memory like a medal no one could see. Ranger gave a soft whine, then stood and faced the road downhill. His ears lifted high. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. No one was there, yet the porch lamp hanging shattered beside the door swayed once on its broken chain. Just once. Then it became still. Ethan rose slowly, slipped the key into his pocket and gathered the satchel, the box, and the letter. The morning no longer felt ordinary enough to ignore. As he stepped off the porch, the neighbor woman opened her window a crack and called out, "Did you find anything?" Ethan looked back at the ruined house, then at Ranger already waiting by the truck. "I think," he said softly, "something found me." When a man has been lost for years, even a small direction can feel like mercy. Ethan drove down from the ridge with both hands steady on the wheel, though little inside him felt steady at all. Ranger rode in the passenger seat this time, posture tall, nose near the cracked window, drawing in the scents of pine, wet earth, and whatever invisible trail had begun the night before. The envelope rested on the dashboard beside the brass key. Sunlight struck it now and then through the windshield, making the paper glow brighter than paper should. Blackwater Ridge moved through its ordinary morning below them. A mail carrier waved from the curb. 2 boys pedaled bicycles past the diner. Mrs. Talbot arranged pumpkins outside her produce stand. Nothing in town suggested that dead men were giving rides home or that hidden letters waited beneath ruined porches. Yet Ethan had learned in war that the strangest truths often arrived dressed like normal days. He parked behind Miller's Hardware and carried the satchel upstairs to his rented room above the garage. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a hot plate, and one window facing the alley. Claire's photograph stood on the shelf beside a chipped coffee mug. Ethan set the silver ring next to it and stared for a long moment. "You always did hate subtlety," he said softly. Ranger lay near the door, head on paws, but his ears stayed alert. Ethan spread the papers from Samuel's satchel across the table. Most were receipts, handwritten notes, and church bulletins from years long gone. Several pages listed names beside dollar amounts, groceries, winter coats, rent assistance, medicine. Quiet acts of help, carefully recorded. Samuel had spent much of his life giving away what he had. Tucked near the bottom was a folded map of Miller Woods with one path marked in blue ink leading to St. Bartholomew Chapel. In the corner were 3 words written small and firm. "Before sunset only." Ethan checked the clock. Just after 1 in the afternoon. Plenty of time, yet urgency moved through him like weather. He showered, changed into dry clothes, and packed a flashlight, water bottle, and work gloves. Old habits preferred preparation to wonder. By 3 o'clock he and Ranger were on the north trail where pines rose tall enough to swallow sound. The woods smelled of sap and damp leaves. Sunbeams fell through branches in long columns that turned drifting dust to gold. Ranger trotted ahead with purpose, occasionally glancing back to be sure Ethan followed. "You know more than I do," Ethan said. The dog flicked one ear as if agreement required no modesty. After nearly a mile, the trees opened around a clearing where the chapel stood. St. Bartholomew was smaller than Ethan remembered, built of dark stone with a steep roof and narrow windows filmed by age. Ivy gripped one wall. The front doors were chained shut. A weather-beaten bell tower leaned slightly west, as though listening to the wind. Yet the place did not feel abandoned. It felt waiting. Ethan circled to the side path where faded red paint still clung to a wooden door half hidden by vines. The brass key in his pocket seemed warmer now. Ranger stopped before the threshold and stared at the handle without moving. "What is it?" Ethan asked. The shepherd gave one low whine, not fear but warning mixed with expectation. Ethan slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, as if used that morning. Before he could open the door, the chapel bell above them rang 3 slow notes across the empty woods, though no hand touched the rope and no wind stirred the trees. There are places where silence feels empty, and places where silence feels full of witnesses. Ethan stood motionless beneath the leaning bell tower while the final note faded into the trees. Ranger's ears remained high, body alert, yet the dog did not growl. Whatever lived in that sound had not come as threat. Ethan wrapped his hand around the iron handle and pushed the red door inward. Hinges moved without complaint. Cool. Air drifted out carrying the scent of cedar, old stone, candle wax, and rain long dried. The chapel interior lay in gentle shadow. Narrow beams of late sunlight slipped through stained glass windows, painting the wooden floor in faded reds and blues. Dust floated through the colored light like slow snow. Rows of pews stood neat and undisturbed. At the far end, a simple altar of white oak faced the room beneath a plain wooden cross. Nothing appeared broken. Nothing looked abandoned. It felt less like neglect and more like pause. Ranger stepped in first, paused silent on the floorboards. He moved down the center aisle with measured dignity, occasionally stopping to glance behind and make sure Ethan followed. The veteran's boots echoed softly, each step sounding louder than it should. He had entered ruined buildings before, forgotten places where rot and time had taken over. This was different. Someone had cared for this room, if not recently then faithfully. No cobwebs hung from the rafters. No mold stained the walls. Even the hymn books in their racks were aligned. Ethan touched one pew and found only a thin trace of dust. On the altar sat a brass candleholder with 3 white candles. The center candle was burned halfway down, its wax fresh enough to hold scent. "Who comes here?" Ethan whispered. The chapel answered with stillness. Ranger veered suddenly left toward a side wall lined with memorial plaques. He sniffed each one carefully, then stopped before a narrow wooden panel nearly hidden by shadow. It looked like decorative trim until the dog pawed once at the floor beside it. Ethan knelt and examined the panel. A small keyhole waited near the bottom, almost invisible in the grain. He drew the brass key from his pocket. It fit as naturally as if carved for no other purpose. With a soft turn, the panel clicked and swung inward. Behind it was a stairway descending into dimness. Cold air rose from below carrying the smell of stone and something faintly sweet, like old apples. Ranger did not hesitate. He started down at once, tail level, confident. Ethan switched on his flashlight and followed. The steps led beneath the chapel into a vaulted cellar built of fieldstone blocks. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with canned goods, blankets, lanterns, boxes of soap, coats in sealed bins, sacks of flour and rice. A hidden supply room, organized with military precision. In the center stood a long wooden table covered with folders and ledgers. On one wall, hand-painted words read, "For those who arrive with nothing." Ethan's throat tightened. Samuel had not hidden treasure for himself. He had hidden mercy. Ranger approached the table and rested his nose on a fresh envelope placed squarely in the center. Ethan's name was written across it in the same careful hand. Beside the envelope lay a framed photograph of Samuel Reed standing with 3 homeless men, smiling beneath the chapel bell. The date in the corner read 1997. Ethan picked up the letter with unsteady fingers. Before opening it, he noticed something else tucked beneath the frame, a modern keycard attached to a tag labeled Ridge Haven Shelter. Active Director Access. He stared at it in disbelief. The nearest shelter had closed 2 years ago. Yet when he opened the second letter, the first sentence made the room feel suddenly alive. Some doors were never closed, Ethan. They were waiting for someone willing to reopen them. Hope often arrives disguised as responsibility. Ethan stood beneath the chapel with the second letter open in his hands while Ranger waited beside the table, calm and watchful. The room smelled of cedar shelves, dry grain, and the kind of order built by years of quiet service. He continued reading. Ridge Haven Shelter was never meant to belong to boards, committees, or men who count numbers more carefully than people. It was built for those who sleep cold and wake forgotten. If this letter found you, then the shelter can live again. Enclosed is access. In the top drawer you will find deeds, account records, and names of those who once helped me. Some have gone home to heaven. Some still wait for a reason to believe. Ethan opened the drawer. Inside were folders arranged with careful tabs, a bank packet, maintenance contracts, utility records, and a notarized transfer document naming Ethan Walker as acting trustee upon acceptance of stewardship. His knees nearly gave way. He had never owned more than an old truck, a few tools, and the memories he tried not to inventory. Yet here lay keys to a building he thought closed forever. The letter continued. This is not payment for kindness. Kindness cannot be purchased. It is recognition. You know what it means to feel outside the door. Therefore you will know how to welcome others in. Ethan lowered the page. No sentence had ever described him more plainly. After Claire died, he had drifted through jobs, through rooms, through days that never felt fully entered. He understood hunger that was not always about food. He understood the pride that keeps a hurting person from asking. Ranger rose and placed both front paws lightly against Ethan's thigh, bringing him back to the room. You think I can do this? Ethan asked. The dog answered with one slow tail sweep. Ethan laughed despite himself, the sound rusty from disuse. He spent the next hour reading ledgers and inspecting supplies. Samuel had stocked enough blankets and canned goods for months. There were winter coats sorted by size, first aid kits unopened, shelves of toiletries, even children's coloring books stacked beside board games. Mercy, Ethan realized, had been prepared down to the smallest detail. At last he climbed the stairs back into the chapel. Evening light streamed through stained glass in deeper colors now, turning the floor into rivers of amber and blue. On the front pew rested another surprise. A thermos of hot coffee, steam still rising, and a paper sack containing 2 fresh biscuits wrapped in cloth. Ethan looked around sharply. Hello. No answer came. Only the gentle creak of settling wood. He touched the thermos. Warm. Very warm. Ranger sniffed the biscuits, then sat politely as if already instructed to wait. Ethan poured a little coffee into the lid cup. It was strong, rich, and exactly the way Claire used to make it on cold mornings. He set the cup down slowly. Some mysteries do not need solving to be real. In the sack beside the food lay a folded note written in the same hand. Feed the dog first. Then drive to Ridge Haven before dark. Someone is waiting at the front gate. Ethan handed Ranger half a biscuit and watched the shepherd take it gently. Outside, the sun lowered behind Miller Woods, gilding the chapel stones with evening fire. Ethan slipped the keycard into his pocket, gathered the folders, and headed for the truck. As he started the engine, the old bell rang once above him, soft and certain, like a blessing sent after a man finally chose to believe it was meant for him. Sometimes the longest road home is only a few miles, but it passes through everything a man thought was over. Ethan drove out of Miller Woods with the chapel fading in his rearview mirror and the evening sun burning low between the trees. Ranger sat tall beside him, crumbs from the biscuit still on one whisker, eyes fixed ahead as though he already knew where the road would end. The folders from Samuel's hidden room rested on the seat between them. Every few seconds Ethan glanced at the keycard in the cup holder, half expecting it to vanish like mist. Ridge Haven's shelter stood on the east side of town near the old rail yard, a brick building once praised in the newspaper and later forgotten in budget meetings. Ethan remembered volunteering there one Thanksgiving years ago, before Claire got sick, before grief became his full-time occupation. He had served stew, fixed a broken sink, and promised to come back. Then life closed around him like winter water. The streets of Blackwater Ridge glowed amber in the setting light as he passed storefronts closing for the day. Mrs. Talbot waved while pulling in her produce signs. Children chased each other across a church lawn. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin blue threads. Ordinary scenes, yet Ethan felt as if he were seeing the town from a new height. When he turned onto Harbor Street, Ranger suddenly leaned forward and gave one sharp bark. At the end of the block stood Ridge Haven. The three-story brick building looked tired but sturdy, its windows dusty, its sign hanging crooked above the front steps. Weeds pushed through cracks in the sidewalk. One exterior light near the entrance flickered weakly in the growing dusk. And at the locked front gate stood a woman wrapped in a tan coat, holding 2 grocery bags and stamping her feet against the cold. Beside her sat a little girl no older than 7 with a backpack in her lap and a knitted rabbit tucked under one arm. Ethan parked and stepped out. Ranger came around the truck at once, calm but attentive. The woman straightened, embarrassed to be seen waiting. She was perhaps 30, face tired but dignified, hair pinned back in haste. "I am sorry," she said. "Someone told me this place might reopen tonight." Ethan looked toward the dark windows, then back at her. "Who told you that?" She hesitated. "An older man with a white coat and a cane. He met us near the bus station this afternoon. He said a good man would arrive before sunset." Ethan felt the evening air turn still around him. The little girl studied Ranger with wide eyes. "The dog was in his story," she whispered. Ranger lowered himself to the sidewalk so he seemed less large, then gently touched his nose to the child's rabbit. She smiled for the first time. Ethan approached the keypad beside the gate. Dust covered the buttons except one recent clean swipe across the reader slot. His pulse quickened. He slid in the keycard. For one breath nothing happened. Then a green light blinked alive, the latch clicked open, and the front porch lamp above them flared bright and steady as if power had been waiting behind the walls. The woman covered her mouth. Inside the lobby, lights came on one by one deeper in the building, hall after hall, room after room, like a sleeping place waking from years of darkness. Ethan opened the gate and held it wide. "Come in," he said softly, surprising himself with how certain he sounded. As they stepped inside, Ranger paused and looked back toward the empty street. Far down Harbor Street, beneath the last gold of sunset, a man in a white coat stood with one hand raised in farewell before the light moved and he was gone. Buildings remember the hands that once cared for them. Ridge Haven seemed to know the difference between being opened and being welcomed. Ethan stepped into the lobby with the woman and her daughter while Ranger padded across the worn tile floor, nails clicking softly in the warm light. The air carried the scent of dust, lemon cleaner. An old radiator heat slowly waking after years of sleep. Lamps glowed along the hallway. Somewhere deep inside, pipes knocked once and then settled into a steady hum. The little girl turned in a slow circle, eyes wide. "It feels alive," she whispered. Ethan could not argue. He introduced himself and learned their names were Marissa Cole and her daughter Lily. Their bus from Dayton had arrived late after Marissa accepted a housekeeping interview in town that began the next morning. The room they were promised had fallen through. With no money left for a motel, they had nowhere to go. "Then tonight you are here," Ethan said, surprising himself again with how naturally the words came. He found a clipboard on the front desk beside a ring of labeled keys and an old guest ledger open to a blank page, as though waiting for ink. He wrote their names in careful block letters. Ranger stood beside Lily while she petted the soft fur behind his ears. The dog closed his eyes in patient approval. Ethan took them upstairs to room 204. The hallway lights flickered on ahead of them one section at a time, guiding rather than failing. Room 204 was simple but clean, 2 twin beds, fresh sheets folded at the footboards, towels stacked neatly, and a small vase on the dresser holding artificial daisies. Marissa touched the blankets as if afraid they might disappear. "How is any of this possible?" she asked. Ethan looked around the room he had never prepared. "I am trying to figure that out myself." Downstairs he continued exploring. The kitchen refrigerators were humming and stocked with eggs, milk, fruit, sandwich meat, and bread dated that very week. Pantry shelves held soup, pasta, cereal, peanut butter, canned vegetables, and coffee enough for an army. In the office he found current utility receipts marked paid, insurance renewed, and maintenance logs signed monthly by a company from the next county. Someone had kept Ridge Haven breathing in secret. Inside the top desk drawer lay another envelope with his name on it. He opened it slowly. Stewardship is easier than ownership because it remembers who things belong to. Feed whoever arrives. Charge no pride at the door. Ask for help when needed. The town has kinder hearts than fear suggests. Attached was a list of names and numbers. Pastor Helen Moore. Frank Donnelly, electrician. Rosa Vega, retired nurse. Danny Pike, grocery owner. People willing to help, preserved like seeds. Ethan spent the next hour making beds in 3 more rooms, wiping counters, and starting a pot of coffee simply because the smell made places feel cared for. Ranger patrolled each floor, checking corners, then returned to the lobby satisfied. At 9 o'clock a knock came at the front door. Then another. Outside stood an older man with a duffel bag and a young mechanic still wearing grease-stained coveralls. Word had already spread. Ethan let them in. By 10, 6 people occupied rooms once dark and empty. Laughter drifted from the kitchen where Lily helped butter toast. Marissa folded towels as if repaying grace with motion. Ethan leaned against the front desk, exhausted in a new and welcome way. Above him hung a framed photograph he had not noticed earlier. It showed Samuel Reed decades younger, standing in this same lobby beneath a sign that read "No one turned away." Beside Samuel stood a woman smiling warmly. Claire's mother. Family truths often wait until a man is finally strong enough to carry them. Ethan stared at the photograph above the front desk while the lobby sounds softened behind him. Samuel Reed stood younger and straight-backed in a dark suit, one hand resting on the counter. Beside him smiled a woman with kind eyes, silver hair pinned neatly, and the same crescent dimple Claire had whenever she laughed too hard. Margaret Hale. Claire's mother. Ethan had met her only twice before illness and distance complicated every road between families. She had lived 2 states away and passed several years before Claire did. Yet there she was, standing in Ridge Haven as if she had belonged there all along. Ranger came to Ethan's side and sat quietly, sensing the shift in him. Ethan lifted the frame from the wall. On the back, taped carefully beneath the stand, was a folded note. His hands shook before he even opened it. "If Ethan ever comes here, please tell him I was proud to call him son." The handwriting was Margaret's, elegant and certain. He had not heard those words while she lived. Pride had often been hidden in that generation behind casseroles, practical advice, and rides to the airport. Tears blurred the ink. He sat down hard in the office chair and read the rest. "Samuel and I began helping at Ridge Haven after my husband passed. We learned grief can either close a hand or open it. Claire always believed you would choose the second path, even when pain made you forget yourself. If life ever leaves you lonely, come where lonely people gather. You will be needed there." Ethan covered his eyes. Claire had known. Somehow she had known the shape of his future long before he did. He remembered winter evenings when she packed extra blankets into the truck and asked him to drive downtown. He thought they were making donations. Perhaps she had been leaving breadcrumbs. Marissa appeared in the doorway holding 2 mugs of coffee. She paused when she saw his face. "I can come back," she said softly. Ethan shook his head and accepted the mug. "Thank you." She glanced at the photograph. "She looks like someone who prayed often." Ethan smiled through the ache. "She looks like my family." Marissa nodded as if that answered more than the picture. Upstairs, Lily laughed at something the mechanic said. The sound traveled down the hall like sunlight through a crack. Ethan rose and walked through the shelter with fresh eyes. Every room now held a story in motion. The older man in room 103 had already offered to sweep the sidewalks in exchange for breakfast. The mechanic asked if he could repair the furnace in the west wing. Marissa volunteered to clean rooms between job interviews. Need, he realized, often arrives carrying skills. People were not burdens waiting to be managed. They were gifts waiting to be trusted. Near midnight Pastor Helen Moore arrived with casseroles, blankets, and a toolbox because she claimed every ministry eventually required all three. She took one look at Ethan and said, "Samuel finally found you." Ethan stared. "You knew him?" She smiled gently. Everyone who ever got back on their feet in this town knew him, even if they never learned his name. She handed Ethan a sealed envelope discovered in the church archives years ago, marked "Deliver when the soldier returns." Ethan opened it slowly. Inside was a single sentence in Claire's handwriting. "When you are ready to live again, follow the dog." Ranger thumped his tail once against the floor, as if he had been keeping that secret longer than anyone. Healing rarely arrives as a single moment. More often, it comes room by room, light by light, choice by choice. Morning entered Ridge Haven through tall east windows, laying bands of gold across the lobby floor where Ranger already stood watch like a manager who trusted no schedule but his own. Ethan had slept barely 3 hours in the office chair, yet he woke with a kind of tiredness that felt honest instead of hollow. The shelter stirred around him. Pans clinked in the kitchen. Coffee brewed. Someone laughed upstairs. A shower ran behind one closed door. Life, after years of silence, was making noise again. Marissa had started breakfast before dawn, turning eggs and toast into enough plates for everyone. The mechanic, whose name was Trevor, had already opened the furnace panel and declared it old but loyal. The older man from room 103 introduced himself as Walter and swept the front steps with the seriousness of a man reclaiming dignity one stroke at a time. Lily sat at the lobby desk drawing Ranger with enormous heroic ears. Ethan looked around and understood something simple. People did not need saving nearly as often as they needed a place to begin again. By noon, Pastor Helen returned with volunteers, fresh towels, and news that spread faster than any flyer. Ridge Haven is open. A line formed quietly outside the gate, a veteran sleeping in his truck, a waitress escaping rent she could no longer afford, a father and son between apartments, a widow whose pipes froze last winter and never recovered. Ethan welcomed each one by name once he learned it. No forms first. No suspicion first. Samuel's rule hung above the desk now in fresh marker on clean poster board. No one turned away. Throughout the day, donations arrived from every corner of town. Danny Pike sent bread, milk, and canned soup. Mrs. Talbot brought apples and pumpkins. Frank Donnelly repaired hallway lights without billing a penny. Even people who could not stay long came to carry boxes, scrub walls, and make beds. Kindness, Ethan discovered, was more contagious than fear. Late that afternoon he finally walked to the small courtyard behind the shelter where weeds had overtaken a once-loved garden. Ranger trotted ahead and stopped beside a stone bench warmed by sun. Ethan sat heavily, the day settling into his bones. In his pocket he still carried Claire's note. "When you are ready to live again, follow the dog." He looked at Ranger, who was now digging gently beneath a rose bush gone wild. "You have excellent timing," Ethan said. The dog pawed once more, then stepped back. Buried shallow in the soil was a mason jar sealed tight. Inside rested another folded letter, dry as if placed that morning. Ethan laughed aloud, half in wonder, half in surrender. He opened it carefully. "Dear stubborn man, if you found this, then you finally listened to everyone except yourself. I asked Samuel years ago to help if you ever got lost after I was gone. He promised he would. Do not waste time asking how. Heaven has better uses for mystery than explanation. Love them well. That is how you keep loving me. Claire." Ethan pressed the letter to his chest and closed his eyes. For the first time since the hospital room, grief did not feel like an ending. It felt like a doorway left open. When he returned inside, the lobby was full, the kitchen warm, and laughter echoing down the stairs. Ranger walked beside him through the noise as if leading him into the life that had been waiting all along. Miracles do not always arrive to change the world. Sometimes they arrive to change one man, and trust him to change the rest. Autumn settled over Blackwater Ridge in bright leaves and cool mornings, and Ridge Haven no longer looked like a forgotten building. Fresh paint covered the old brick trim. Window boxes held mums in orange and white. The front sign stood straight again, polished clean, its letters simple and steady. Ridge Haven. Lights glowed every evening before sunset, and the smell of supper often reached the sidewalk before the first guests did. Ethan Walker had become the kind of man who woke before dawn without dread. He checked boilers, answered phones, patched drywall, carried groceries, and somehow always knew when someone needed silence more than advice. The old loneliness that once followed him now had trouble keeping pace. Ranger remained chief of everything important. He greeted newcomers at the gate, escorted children to the dining hall, and stationed himself beside anyone crying quietly enough to think no one noticed. Townspeople swore the dog could sense sorrow before words found it. They were probably right. Marissa got the housekeeping job and soon managed the shelter laundry room with military precision. Trevor stayed on as maintenance supervisor and fixed anything that dared break. Walter ran the front desk 3 afternoons a week wearing donated ties and great seriousness. Lily, now taller and louder, had taped her drawing of Ranger in a superhero cape beside the lobby clock. Underneath it she wrote, "He finds people." On the first snowfall of December, Pastor Helen held a small gathering in the courtyard garden where weeds once ruled. New benches circled trimmed rose bushes. Lanterns glowed from hooks in the trees. Residents, volunteers, and neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder while steam rose from cups of cocoa. Ethan disliked speeches, so naturally everyone asked for one. He cleared his throat, glanced at Ranger, and kept it brief. "I thought I lost everything worth keeping," he said. "Turns out some things wait for us in other people." The crowd grew quiet in that warm, respectful way kindness creates. Then applause rose like weather. Later that night, after dishes were washed and halls settled into sleep, Ethan stepped outside alone. Snow fell softly across Harbor Street, turning the town gentle and bright. Ranger padded beside him to the gate, then suddenly stopped and looked down the sidewalk. A figure stood beneath the street lamp at the corner. White coat. Cane in one hand. Straight posture. Calm as moonlight. Ethan's breath caught, but fear never came. Samuel Reed lifted his free hand in greeting. Ethan raised his own. Neither needed words. After a moment, a passing truck moved between them, and when it cleared the corner stood empty except for drifting snow. Ranger gave one soft bark, then leaned against Ethan's leg. They walked back inside together. On the front desk lay a fresh envelope, dry despite the storm, addressed in familiar careful script. Ethan opened it slowly. Inside was a single line. "Kindness always returns, though seldom by the road you expect." No signature followed. None was needed. Ethan placed the letter beneath the lobby clock beside Lily's drawing, turned off the desk lamp, and listened to the shelter breathe around him. Upstairs, someone laughed in their sleep. In the kitchen, pipes hummed warm through the walls. Outside, snow kept falling over a town that had remembered itself. And in the quiet center of it all, a once broken man finally felt at home.